You have to understand that I went to a university that, we would go and never see the team win. Yeah, I mean, that was not considered a bad thing. All right, are we doing okay, Matthew?
Yeah, we're live.
We're live. Thank you so much for being here. This has been filmed in front of a studio audience, and we are so grateful for it. We're grateful for you at home for tuning in to this wonderful course on James Allison. And we're looking at a book that is going to be a little bit intimidating to some of us if you've never read theology before, but we're going to try to make it super, super easy and accessible to you as we think through this. And this book was groundbreaking 20 years ago, and it still has an incredible light to shine on us today. And my job is to teach with Father Chris and with Joe to do an incredible presentation as best we can of this and to open up conversation. If you have not read this book, that is not a problem because the way we're going to present it is going to be a kind of overview of this, and we'll have an opportunity to engage and to wrestle with things, and it'll also force us to say more about what is in this book, because I've kind of skimmed like a stone through it to try to get a lot of material presented in a digestible way. And Joe Ballesteri and I are going to do an on again and an off again presentation. So today it's going to be me, and then next week it's going to be James Allison himself, and he's going to be talking about salvation and resurrection and some beautiful things. And then it'll be, I think it's going to be we'll just kind of alternate until we finish in just a few weeks after that. So without further ado, let's open with prayer, and then we'll just get into this presentation, and then we'll listen to you. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. We thank you, dear God, that you have been the model of a self-giving other to us, and coming to us as you are with your grace. You have completely disarmed us, and you have returned us again to the connection that we have with you, the connection that we had with you from the beginning, that you had with the world you so loved. We ask that you would open our eyes to see all that separates us from you. We ask that you would open our hearts so that we can step into the persons you are calling us to be. And we ask that you would give us grace to wrestle with these things so that we can see your grace and love in the world around us more clearly. These things we ask in your mighty name. Amen. So, James Allison was, in his early career, was known primarily as an interpreter of René Girard. And this book is an example of René Girard. But one of the things that I hope that we work on when we think through everything that is involved in this book is that he does it because he believes it opens up his understanding of the Christian faith in new ways. And so I'm going to do my best in this presentation to speak to some of the things that he assumes that you all already know about original sin and about the life of God. And then I'm also going to be talking a little bit about René Girard, because I never know where people are when it comes to this. When I was in graduate school at Yale, my second year, I got into a fight with a classmate. I don't know why. We had tension between us, and he took me out for coffee, and he said, I just sense such memetic competition between us. And I had no idea what he was talking about. So he was trying to disarm it, but I thought, here he goes again, just showing off. But I am better for this. So the Joy of Being Wrong, Original Sin Through Easter Eyes. This is the picture of the book. We do have a few copies left. You can also get it on Kindle, and the Kindle version is great. The first part of it is called Constructing a Theological Anthropology. And that title alone is something we're going to unpack a bit as we move forward. But the first question I want to ask is, what is original sin? And that's the prior question we have to ask. And I looked at our catechism, which is in your pews, and you can find it. It says two interrogatory questions and answers. What is sin? Sin is the seeking of our own will instead of the will of God, and thus distorting our relationship with God, with other people, and with all creation. And the second question is, how does sin have power over us? Sin has power over us because we lose our liberty when our relationship with God is distorted. Now, one of the things that talking about sin can seem like a problematic journey, because so often we seem to know exactly what we're talking about. It's the thing that makes us ashamed or that makes us feel guilty. But there is a theological reason why we engage in the study of sin. And that is that when you spend your time thinking about what destroys your relationship with God, that actually helps you know what builds up or restores your relationship with God. It's a little bit like, to use a funny analogy, if you are in a dysfunctional family of origin in which there was never a peaceful dinner and there was never a moment in which people weren't yelling or screaming or getting drunk or throwing things or doing something, and then you go to a boyfriend or girlfriend's house for dinner the first time, and it's just so nice. And you kind of realize, my God, I know exactly what's going wrong, but I don't know what's going right. I can't even begin to understand. But in some sense, that education that you had growing up, that dysfunction kind of created in you a sense of what love would look like. And when you see it, you kind of see it because of the absence of the things that are there. So the same way, people study sin, and they study sin because they want to avoid it, but they also study it because there's a kind of way of learning what sin is that helps us understand what grace is and what love is and who God is. And one of the things that I've done to just break it up, sin is stagnation, disconnection, destruction, and grace is transformation, connection, and creation. And that may be a little bit too broad, but if I were going to say one of the things that I would see operative in this book is that kind of basic understanding of stagnation, disconnection, and destruction, and transformation, connection, and creation. So is every sin the same? Some parts of the Bible make it seem like there are many different forms of sin, such as the 7 deadly sins, and I brought a little schematic for you all. This is the 7 deadly sins. It's quite powerful. I got it at the Encyclopedia Britannica, and so you have pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, sloth, and each of these 7 deadly sins were formed in part by a pope, surprisingly, and was done by Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century, and he was a reformer of sorts. And then it was elaborated on by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. And part of the reason why people focused on these 7 deadly sins was to actually identify the kind of antidote in our life, or the thing that counteracts it. So the counteraction of pride is humility, of greed is generosity, of lust is chastity, of envy is gratitude, of gluttony is temperance, of wrath is patience, and sloth is diligence, is the way many people would go through this wheel of misfortune. And it's a helpful way, and it's one of the ways people have thought about it. But the question comes, is every sin the same? And most often, when you read anybody who writes about sin, there's a root sin that is at the core of things. It's the kind of branch or the root out of which all the branches grow. And it's some continuum between the self and its desires. And I just threw some of these up because you'll see them defined by people, and I can take time to define them, or any of you who read theology will see that these are representative examples. So one, of course, is self-will, which is what we had in our Book of Common Prayer, as opposed to God's will. And one of the things that I wonder about that is that what are the conditions under which self-will is a good thing or a bad thing? Sometimes it can be a good thing. And so one of the questions we can have of sin is like, what is that? Does that definition of sin work well for me? Pride is a major one. It's used by Augustine and also later on by Reinhold Niebuhr. Lust is used as an example of sin often by people who have a bit of fear about what happens from the neck down in people. Faithlessness was actually Luther's, one of his favorite definitions of sin was the lack of belief or the disbelief in grace and God. And then will to power, as opposed to, say, the will to love, has been brought up a lot. There's also a proneness to violence. There's the libido dominandi, the kind of desire to dominate others. The list can go on and on and on. And it depends upon who the theologian is, what they're kind of thinking about, what is the thing that they're trying to identify. Is this going well so far? Everybody's following along, a little background? So then, here is, we get to the meat of the potato. What is original sin? And it has three components. The first is that we are not able to not sin. I've taken out as much jargon as possible in this. We have an innate propensity to sin that impairs and distorts us. If you were raised in a more theologically conservative tradition, the word that would be used here is innate depravity. Children learn that even before they know what that means. But what it means is we are not able to not sin. The second is we have experienced loss and damage as human beings because of our disobedience. And that can be defined in different ways. Some people see it as a kind of loss of some higher desires that we should have. And that was how Augustine saw it. And believe it or not, that's pretty much how James Allison is going to see it. But for more reformed thinkers, we lost our minds. And so what gets restored is our minds learn how to think better. And the reason why that's important is because then that elevates revelation, the way that people have to rely upon God's word. And a third element of original sin is inherited guilt and responsibility. And this is an interesting one in that it's not just that Adam is the first sinner, but there was a sense in which we had a kind of representation in Adam, so that when Adam sinned, we all sinned. Now, that is the one that really people have struggled with since about the 17th century, because it seems wrong that we should be guilty for what somebody else did, is what was originally said. And the answer that most people give when they think about this, and I hope this is helpful and gets us going, is that there's a kind of vicariousness in sin, which means when one person sins, the other person is somehow brought into it or affected by it. And that's a kind of mirror image of the vicariousness of Christ. That just as Jesus was able to die for us, so we were able to die because of someone else's death. So that third one is the one that most people today have the hardest time swallowing, because they don't always see the work that it's doing. They understand we are not able to not sin. We have an innate propensity to sin. George Limbeck, one of the great theologians at Yale, said that the doctrine of original sin is best proved empirically. You just look around you and you see people doing it, bad things all the time, and disappointing things and disillusioning things. And the second one, we have experienced loss or damage. We can disagree whether it's a damage in the mind, or it's a damage in the heart, or it's a kind of sense of a loss of God in our lives. But that seems to follow with a lot of what we experience. My favorite writer on original sin, Jonathan Edwards, in the 18th century, brought up, believe it or not, alcoholism as an example of sin, because he said, look at how a person who is in perfect shape could be introduced to drink, and then suddenly they had this innate propensity to drink, and it ruins their life. And it was an analogy for Edwards of sin. Amazing that he saw it. And then finally, the inherited guilt and responsibility. This kind of became more and more important in the 20th century because it became more and more contentious. And so you'll see that emphasized again and again. Any questions before I go on? Everybody's following along? Excellent.
And we might remind the people at home, if they want to
Yes.
ask a question, to go ahead and just put it in the chat. We've already had a couple comments of people thanking us for streaming this. Thank you.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, guys. I'm gonna try to follow as well, but Chris is totally in charge of that.
One quick question.
Yes, please.
Do you see that this is any different from our antecedents within Judaism?
It's totally different. There's no doctrine of original sin in Judaism. And that is an interesting thing, isn't it? And the reason why we don't, I also think that part of what I'm going to try to say today and maybe over the next few weeks is we also have a much larger doctrine of grace because of original sin. So we believe God forgives always ahead of us because we are weak and we are fallen and we are prone to do disappointing things. And so that's the one thing that as much as we don't want to feel bad about ourselves, I think most of us have done something in our lives where we could identify like that was really a bad thing. And to know that there's grace, even when we fail. Go ahead, Christopher.
So we're not able to not sin? So is there a point? Because when you're born, aren't you really
Pretty innocent.
pure? Innocent,
Yeah.
right? So is it that's just innately within us and that we're probably going to do it? It just depends on the circumstances of each one's life?
This is so amazing. That's such a great question because the answer is yes. It seems completely unfair, doesn't it? But it means that we've been born with this kind of predisposition, almost like we have like a genetic failure that if you get involved with it, if you do anything with it, it's just gonna surface at some point or another. Yeah, I know, it's hard.
Some people will keep, I guess from my own experience, my mother said, "You were such a sweet kid, followed rules, always did," and then one day, boom.
Yes.
I completely fell in with the wrong crowd. She says, almost like you just made all these horrible choices. And
Yes.
it's
Yes.
like, what?
It's
like it got unleashed.
Exactly, and that's and that's part of it. I mean, that's part of the whole kit and caboodle, right? Because the doctrine of original sin would say that your mom was operating under a veil of ignorance when she saw you as a child. And people take this to extremes. I mean, I'd be completely honest with you, because at one point, Augustine, who is the originator of this doctrine, Augustine, he believed that the most miserable thing you could ever be on earth was a child. Because, you can't do philosophy, you're incontinent, it's horrible, it's completely embarrassing, that's the worst thing you could do. And so, and Augustine believed that children were just full of the devil. And so when they would cry when they're being baptized, he would say, that's the devil getting out of them. Just like any kind of when Jesus would cast out a demon in the scriptures and the people would writhe, Augustine says, well, there you go. The child's crying because the devil's in him. And Augustine was a brilliant soul. Well, there's three, the question we have to ask is, why does this original sin matter if all of this is there. And as I've been trying to say, is because it tells us what kind of help we need to reconnect and reconcile with God. And I find that really helpful because there's a saying that I've learned in a certain program that I follow, which is that insight is no protection sometimes. And we need more than new knowledge. One of the things that we tend to think about when we think about the things that have gone wrong in our lives is we try to reel back and say, oh, it was the patterning I had in my life, without realizing that our parents might have been working just heroically with flawed material and doing everything they could, but we blame the patterning. It's not the knowledge that we need, it's actually that we need a kind of transformation, and we need transformation in our will, in our desire, a rebirth, and a regeneration. And so the doctrine of original sin basically heightens how much grace we need in our lives. And that's where it does separate from Judaism. And as Allison says in this, and I know there's an exciting part where he talks about leather jackets, which is why Joe is wearing a leather jacket tonight. Thank you, Joe Balistrelli. You are the lesson. You are the lesson. There's a thing that Allison says is that the problem with Christian doctrine is it was like beginning with a door and trying to build a house out from that door, which we almost tried over here. And that door for Allison is the resurrection. And so most of the doctrines that we have about original sin are there in many ways to enshrine grace. That's not to make it more palatable to you, but just to give some feedback about that. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was just, in my 15 years thinking about God on this planet, I've never gotten a lot of mileage out of original sin.
Yeah.
Because it strikes me that everything you have on the screen here is true whether or not you think sin is baked into your DNA,
Yeah.
or whether it rubs off on you vicariously as you develop consciousness. Like I saw my girls, I felt like I named the day when Gianna got consciousness enough to notice that she didn't get the toy she wanted and got mad. And it was like, that was the moment she just ate from the apple.
That's right.
It happened right before my eyes.
Right.
Prior to that, I'm not so sure, But either way, I don't know. All this is still true, right? We still need, whether it rubs off on you or not, that's unavoidably going to rub off as a matter of becoming a conscious person, or whether it's baked into your DNA through original sin. It strikes me that all of this still is true anyway.
It's true, but Joe Balistrelli wants to jump in.
I'm jumping in. So what I find so fascinating about Allison's writing is in talking about René Girard. René Girard was not a Christian when he was writing about the history of how humans came to be in sociology and societies. Girard came to the realization that our very being as humans, evolution, was most likely because of flawed desire, which means that humans were baked this way. It's in the recipe, right?
Yeah.
Making us different from apes. It's literally in the book that way. So whether it's what happens when we're really young or if it's genetic, we don't necessarily know, but it seems in the view of Allison to be what makes us human, is this desire, this flawed desire. So that's the recipe.
And that's a lovely, and that's jumping ahead, and I like it. And the thing that I would also add is that I think that, again, like thinking if there is something innate, then the kind of thing we need to have to get better is not just a new knowledge. It's not just a class we can take. We actually have to, the transformation that you have to have, if it's something innate, is going to be deeper. It's going to require more. So there are 4 stages of spiritual growth with regard to sin. This is classic Christian thought, which is that in our first state, in our state before we had, we bit the apple, as you were saying, Chris, we were able not to sin. Posse non peccare is the Latin, but I don't want to be showing off tonight. And then the second is when we, after the fall, after we ate the apple, to use the myth, we were unable to not sin. And then again, when we are experiencing the rebirth we have in Christ through baptism or through any kind of regeneration of self and in Christ, we go back to kind of being reborn. We're able not to sin. But then there's a moment where we will be a little bit like the angels, where we'll be unable to sin. Non posse peccare. Non posse non peccare. And so the kind of movement within theology is that sin is bound to our creatureliness. It isn't something that actually has to stay forever, and it won't. So how is this good news? Original sin tells us everything depends on God and God's grace given to us by Jesus Christ. That's how original sin is good news. And I think that if I were to re-engineer something beyond Allison about original sin, I would pivot around grace, because that's the only way for me to get to it, rather than around, well, everybody has flaws. So let's go, having talked, this was just a kind of move through Christian thought on sin. We covered, 2,000 years, really. So we're going to now move to the second question. What is a theological anthropology? And what's that?
Fascinating myself.
I know, exactly. Theological anthropology, this is my definition, is an attempt to think through the meaning of the human story and human reality as it is lived out before and with God. And the way that it's done that, for theologians like James Allison, this means engaging with the work of one historical and philosophical anthropologist, René Girard, in particular his theory of desire and scapegoating. Now, when you think about anthropology and you hear that René Girard is an anthropologist, you might think that he might be an anthropologist like the Margaret Mead School. But that's only one branch of anthropology. And in that branch of anthropology, which was popular in France and in Germany and England and the United States, you would practice immersion in a culture. You would begin to live in a culture unlike your own, and then you would start to take careful notes of the ritual symbols, the practices. You would start to learn the language. You would start to map out the hierarchies, the social hierarchies, and then you'd kind of paint a picture. And so here you have Margaret Mead in Samoa in 1929, and here she has bare feet, so no one will know that she's not Samoan. And so that there won't be any flaws in her analysis. And this child is sitting on her lap, and they're kind of, I don't know if these kids are having the best time of their lives, but here she is doing the work of an anthropologist. Now, for the French school of anthropology, it kind of looks a lot more taciturn. It's more like this. Here's René Girard. It is study. I like to tease, you smoke a couple Gaulois, you drink some espresso or some wine, and you kind of name the appearances. But what Girard did is he began to build and look at both literature and psychology, particularly Freud, and he began to build on this idea a kind of explanatory thesis that he saw as a kind of insight into human relations. Girard came out of a school of thought called structuralism, which was one in which you'd kind of try to find these elemental structures that pertain across different categories of knowledge and behavior. And the way that he understood that work is he would kind of test it by reading literature. Now, that doesn't seem as immersive as Margaret Mead, but I want to suggest to you that there's validity to this. And the reason is that literature and plays and philosophy and histories are as much a an artifact of culture as a ritual or as a practice or as a family system. And so in some ways, I think Rene Girard's larger work is just as insightful as Margaret Mead's. It's just as important potentially. And my favorite anthropologist who has written massive books is a French anthropologist named Didier Fessen, and has done brilliant books of anthropology that both draws from his own French school and the more experimental school. So it can be done at an incredibly high level, as it was done by Rene Girard. A friend of mine took a course with him when he was at the University of Chicago, and Girard wrote on his paper, "There is nothing original here." So, but what he has done is he has this incredible insight into scapegoating. And this is a famous 19th century portrait of the scapegoat from the book of Exodus. The red rags here are the rags that we're told were tied to the head of the scapegoat before it was sent out into the wilderness. And it was there that it would basically die by starvation or by consumption by a wild animal. And it was on this scapegoat, all the sins of the community, of the people of God, were transferred to it, and those sins left the compound. They were expunged. They were expelled. And I picked this one because I find this to be one of the early examples where the scapegoat itself is starting to speak. Even though there's not a word coming out of this poor little goat's mouth, you can see in the eyes that it looks at for you, it's kind of looking for gentleness in the viewer, and it's taking place on this incredible, beautiful landscape in which there are bones of animals, and all around death there is a kind of life. And that happened, that was an important painting from the 19th century. And I think in some ways Girard's thought was picking up on something that was moving through the social milieu of the time. Keep in mind, there was more and more scapegoating going on in the 20th century, in the late 19th century. Outsiders were seen as threats, and threats were being contained, and people were being expelled, and people were being exterminated. So I think that in some ways Girard is also reflecting his time period. So to go into the main contours of Rene Girard's anthropology, the first is Memetic Desire. And that's from mimesis, which is Greek for imitate. And it basically means this, that people don't want things because they instinctively want them, but they want things because other people have them. They feel as if they could attain those things, or the status those things bring, they would attain some of the being they imagine the other person having. And so Joe Balistreri helpfully wore a Tom Cruise-like bomber jacket. And Allison gives an example of this. He says that there's a propensity, if Joe shows up with a bomber jacket, that we were looking at it, he wanted to buy it to look like Tom Cruise, who we both admire, and we see this expensive leather jacket, and Joe wants to say, and if he mistakenly tells me, let's imagine that Joe and I are the same size, if he mistakenly tells me that he wants that leather jacket but doesn't have enough money, it will open up for me this opportunity for me to maybe go in and get that leather jacket. And I don't even know that I wanted a leather jacket until I saw Joe have it. And when I saw that he wanted it and would Tom Cruise have it, I didn't even have to think about it. I just had that desire for the leather jacket. It was huge. And so then he and I start to battle it out, trying to get the leather jacket. And then we have two leather jackets, and we're trying to differentiate ourselves, and it gets to be a little sick and weird. And then suddenly someone comes into our midst after the conflict gets multiple and everybody's got leather jackets and we're trying to figure out who is it that we're going to kind of, we need, who is it that's not playing along, who is it that is an other, and we tend to direct the frustration, the kind of the conflict has to find a safe place to go because we don't want to fight it out because we're all too equally powerful, and so you tend to pick this person who is an outsider. And so what happens is with memetic desire is that it's not that you imagine this scenario, it's just that you are kind of claimed in your desires by this scenario. It's something that seems completely unique to yourself, but is actually completely an imitation of what is already there. So when we think about memetic desire, we think about things that we all want and we all want to have, and it tends to have a kind of uniformity, which then kind of breeds increased competition. And so this is one example of memetic desire, and here's another one. I think these are both beautiful and chilling. When we see it from this height, does anybody want to live here? I don't think so, because we feel like there's nothing that makes us feel special. And then, of course, memetic desire can take the form of different kinds of conflict, and this has been painted in the Lithuanian flag, and this is in the Russian flag, and you see a conflict not only between Lithuania and Russia, because they both claim to be the source of origin of their culture, right? But also standing behind all of this is the memetic competition between the United States and Russia. Russia wants to be a great nation. What does that mean? It means controlling the countries that are connected to yourself. That's what it's always meant. You have to have a kind of empire. And so the Ukraine abuts the borders of Russia. And so there is a kind of vocation to be a great nation. Hitler had the same thought, just to say. There are modalities of memetic desire. One is there's acquisitive and possessive desire, which is the innate desire for the bomber jacket, and which creates rivalry. And then there's conflictual or antagonistic mimesis, which is when that conflict goes to the breaking point. When Joe and I are struggling over the jacket and we suddenly fasten on one person. Poor Tim came in and he's got just a yellow shirt on, not a bomber jacket at all. We say, "Isn't Tim awful? Doesn't he? I can't believe he doesn't have a leather jacket." And then we expel him from our little club. That becomes conflictual and antagonistic mimesis. It's when the rivalry itself almost loses importance, and we find this kind of shared anger towards an other whose expulsion or murder or punishment brings peace. So here's one example. Uh-oh. How do I get this? Oh, here we go. Whoops. Oh, gotta go back. Here's my favorite example of memetic desire that I found today on the net. That's all right. Heaven help them when they have a smaller child, or maybe that. And the other is scapegoating. This is the second thing that René Girard has as a key moment. We want others to love what we love, to admire what we admire, but when they do, we suddenly find that they're become competitors, leading to conflict. We deal with this conflict by transferring to a surrogate victim of scapegoat whose death and expulsion united the community and ended violence. Because the community owes its entire order and peace to this victim, the victim is worshipped as sacred, but at the same time, the victim is also believed to be guilty and therefore deserving of the collective violence. Scapegoating works in restoring order, so people keep doing it, albeit in new ways. And so you have a kind of, in more developed cultures, you have this incredibly move that happens, this circle in which you have this kind of peace that happens, and then mimetic rivalry begins, and there's chaos, and then that chaos comes kind of a ritualized finding of the scapegoat. We find something that we want to point to and that's bothering us that we have to expel, and then after we expel that being, after it's killed or murdered or banished, there's a kind of weird worship of the scapegoat and a kind of sacrifice of the scapegoat, and peace comes out. Not a perfect circle, but it kind of works well to see that interaction. Now, there's a third kind of mimetic interaction, and this is called non-rivalistic pacific mimesis. And this is a subversive undoing of mimetic rivalry by gratuitous self-giving rather than conflict. And mimesis here undoes scapegoating and sacrificial violence by showing another way to be human. Does anybody recognize this little being? No, it's close. This is Rolf, what's his name? Rosenberg, who did a beautiful movie called Parable in 1964, and he did it for a pavilion at the World's Fair that was held by the Orthodox and the Protestant churches. And this figure was a Christ figure who came and saved and served this beautiful little community of a circus. He helped water the elephants, and then at some point there's this puppet show where people are in pain and being suspended, and he goes and he begins to wipe the feet of all the people there watching the puppet show, and then he kind of spontaneously lets down the puppets, and they are people, and the people who are the puppets kind of unbuckle and run away, and then he places himself in the harnesses, and the puppet master pulls him up and works him until he dies. And then the next day, you see this same figure just get up and follow the caravan. And it's one of the more interesting images of the and if you think again, this idea of scapegoating is kind of in the zeitgeist, I think, of the 20th century and the 21st century. And this being is an example for me of perfect pacific mimesis. And he's kind of a Christ figure, an other that is both different from us and yet introducing us a different way to be human. So Jesus, James Allison wants to argue, is the model of peaceful mimesis. He's also the scapegoat whose resurrection undoes the scapegoating mechanism. That's the basic argument of the book. And in Jesus and his resurrection, we can reread what it means to be human. Memetic rivalry lies at the core of what it means to be human. It is not only the source of all conflict, but lies at the heart of language, culture, and personhood. And this is a big phrase that he spends a lot of time discussing, and I'm happy to discuss this when we have time. But what Girard argues is that to begin with personhood, our self is not as an individual composed of reason and will and intellect, but we are actually composed by the mirroring of our desires. We are kind of not individual, but interindividual. We are kind of built from this kind of exchange with others. And then the second thing he's going to argue is that all of our language comes from understanding what happens when we go through a scapegoating mechanism. Now, does he have a way to really ground that in hard science? No. But his argument is that the kinds of symbols and rituals that we develop all begin from that kind of basic structure of memetic rivalry and scapegoating. And then third, all of our culture actually works through in one way or another memetic rivalry and scapegoating in one form or another. So this actually makes more sense now than ever, because think about how people present themselves on Instagram, or think about how people present themselves on Facebook. That is just a theater for memetic rivalry. And it makes us miserable until we find people who we can cancel. Uh-oh. All right, let me see. So I'm almost done. So, and then original sin shows us that our capacity to receive gratuitously was damaged in the fall. That's basically what he argues. Not our capacity to receive, but to receive graciously, which is the only way to participate in divine life. So, this is not working. And what Christianity reveals is that the risen Christ is a self-giving victim whose life beyond death reveals the death-locked lie of memetic rivalry flowing from culture's hidden victims. And it is not the original mode of desire, but a distortion of it. So we can define God's love as precisely and only self-giving that is gracious. And that purely gratuitous self-giving other, that is God, affects all of what we want to say about anthropology, which is that we are not so much individuals as interdividuals, comprised at our core by one mode of mimesis or another, and maybe that's where the freedom is. We can choose what will be the mimesis that we do, who we will model ourselves after. We can see in the Trinity, you have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit living in perfect, infinite, peaceful mimesis. This really is prior to the antagonistic mimesis we know best, but which is not first. And then Jesus as the self-giving victim, vindicated by the resurrection. Everything pivots on the resurrection because the scapegoating mechanism is both revealed and destroyed by the resurrection, because it shows that it can't kill the victim. The victim refuses to die. And faith is both a belief in God's revelation as a self-giving victim and as confidence in the church's proclamation of our power to forgive and live out our identity, which has been given back to us through Christ's gratuitous graciousness. And finally, the last thing he does in this big introduction is conversion. Conversion is the joy we experience when we realize our complicity in creating victims, cease to regard ourselves as victims, and live in solidarity with our own and others' victims, even though this will increase the likelihood of being victimized. So those are the big things. So the questions I have. What rings true to you in this? What baffles you? What troubles you? What comforts you? What does the joy of being wrong look like to you? And then finally, do we really need the doctrine of original sin? What do you think? Mark, we should get the
Sure. So I find Gerard's view of mimesis interesting, and the sense of modeling is very much part of my understanding of driving forces of culture. And one of the interesting things is the large differences across cultures suggests that process is not as universal as this might suggest. And I think in particular scapegoating as a mechanism seems, to me at least, overrated as a universal driving force of human behavior and human culture. I also think that this describing it as of these things is not inherent in the desire of the object, but only in comparison to others.
Yes.
I mean, that's, I think, helps explain some of the deadly sins, like greed and, but maybe less good around lust, for example, which, or, the gluttony, and other things.
Right, you
that,
wouldn't just eat food if it was convenient to eat it and it didn't taste good, right?
Yet, I mean, that there's brain chemistry
Yeah.
that goes on that triggered by pleasurable experiences. When you give a baby, applesauce, the baby smiles.
Yeah.
That there are some pleasures that then get reinforced and become something that we want more of.
Sure.
And so, at least to me, the sense that it only comes from imitation, or it's not based on some more direct experience of pleasure from the things that I desire, seems incomplete.
Yeah, and I think those are two really good points, so that I want to rephrase them just so that everybody hears them. So the first thing you're saying is, it doesn't seem like you find scapegoating and memetic rivalry in every single culture when you look globally, right? There are contexts in which it just doesn't work the same way. I don't know. The one thing I would say in response is that for Girard, he always would back away when people ask that question, and the reason is that he would say, basically I'm offering an insight into human relations. I'm not trying to explain everything in human relations. And I think, one of the things I asked James Allison when I first met him, back 20 years ago, I said, what you just said, it's not a good theory of violence. Because yes, violence happens out of a memetic rivalry, but oftentimes we oppose the other because we oppose the other, right? And I said something a little bit confronting. I said, 9/11, which we were living through in New York at that time, I said, people don't fly planes in the buildings because of memetic rivalry. That was a strategic decision to wound our culture and our country because they found what we were bringing in completely immoral. And that was that was what Osama bin Laden stated. Whether or not that was exactly the same motivation, but it was one of the things I raised. And so it doesn't explain, I think memetic rivalry works really well when you have a lack of diversity. I think if you look at Bloomfield Hills Country Club or Oakland Hills Country Club, you just see memetic rivalry all over. But do I see that in every culture? I don't think that that's always the case. The second thing you said that I thought was really interesting, which is that there are just some innate things that we want because our body responds to them. Applesauce rather than, say, broccoli makes someone go. And then issues around our bodies and how we experience desire that is innate is something that is pretty normal. And again, I think that that's probably true, although I would want to, the thing that I want to push back a little bit is it wrong to desire applesauce? No, maybe that's not sin, and he's trying to describe sin in a sense. But I do think I have done things which I've eaten in ways that are just meaningless. Like the other day, back before this pandemic happened, I was in Costco, and my pattern in Costco is I used to always go when I was hungry, so that then I could just eat at the stations, and that would be like lunch. And same with Papa Joe's. And then there would be occasionally we'd get a few too many people at the Costco, and and there'd be lines to get the samples, and so then people would start to run to the next one that was opening, and one day it was really crowded, and I was running to the samples. I don't know why. I just saw someone like setting up samples. I'm like, oh, and then like I noticed like a bunch of us are running towards there, and I said, what is it? What are they giving? And they said, craisins. Like, who doesn't know what a craisin tastes like, right? It's not even that good. It's like a failed raisin, but I ate 3 cups of them. Like, why did I eat 3 cups of craisins? I knew exactly what they tasted like, but it was free. And it was just to get the endorphins going and to get me to. So I do think, like, even within, my point being is, like, even within things that are simple, like applesauce, there's also things that get laden with other forms of culture. Long answer. And Joe and Chris, jump in if you want to.
So this is new to me, and I'm struggling to be precise, but when I think about growing up in the 60s, when I was a young adolescent, it seems like where we were sociologically, was to define ourselves in my birth family by race and class. Gender was definitely heteronormative. So as a young closeted gay man, I was also wrestling through that, as well as all these issues around white and black, or who are we versus everybody else. So I think this fits within this weird world that I was raised within. It wasn't exactly a country club, but it was definitely a white WASP sort of world in which I'm still sort of clawing my way out of that, trying to understand it all. So this idea is not well formed, but I think there's a lot there for me to chew on.
It's an interesting, thank you for saying that, because I do think there are things that you're socialized to do when you're, and they don't necessarily, and one of the examples he gives in the book, which is so precious, is he talks about being a young English schoolboy and learning English history and realizing as he got older that this was all just ideology. It was like, what England did to the Irish was not good. This kind of thing. So go ahead, jump in.
So I'm just going to jump in with a little bit of personal experience. What baffles me, what troubles me, what comforts me, the Girardian theories around mimesis and scapegoating. When I was first exposed to this about 12 years ago, it just didn't make any sense to me. And I had reactions kind of like Mark's reactions, saying, okay, maybe in certain cultures, and if you look at primitive religion, where you actually had a scapegoating happening. But then over time, different examples would come into my mind. Like there was this kid named Tim in the playground where I grew up in Rochester here, who we kind of threw out of our social group because he was different and because we were arguing over something. And then once he was out of our group, all we talked about was Tim. And we had myths around Tim, and what does Tim do at home, and what does Tim eat? And he became like a minor deity to us. And he was keeping our peace by being our scapegoat victim, right? So, I don't know, it's really interesting, and that was a very homogenous type of social environment. I don't know, it's weird. I still think it doesn't explain everything, but it's very helpful to hear what you're saying about Girard's feeling on this, that this isn't designed to explain everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of chastened structuralism is what I would call it, in that he doesn't think that this can explain every aspect of life. And that's why you'll see in the book he talks about a wisdom Christology, right? And that's basically James trying to just say, well, I can't do everything with this theology, but I can do a lot. Yeah. Who else?
It strikes me too that the way out of mimetic rivalry, as I recall, the options were scapegoating or radical self-giving.
Yeah.
It strikes me that those are two, and also sometimes people just, their tastes and preferences change or evolve. and they leave the mimetic rivalry on their own. They lose interest. I see it between my girls, for example. In that video of the two kids, there comes a point sometimes where one of the kids just says, you know what, I changed my mind. You can have both of them.
That's right.
I'm moving on to something different. And it strikes me that that is also a form of conversion for Christians. And as we move outside of grabbing and holding on to things as a source of salvation, if you will, or happiness or joy, as we become kind of, I don't know, more and more reliant on God, we start to look outside of those things for salvation. And we can find ourselves able to exit mimetic rivalry in that way as well.
I think that's fair. I mean, I think that almost all of the analyses assume a kind of closed system. And then it also assumes that everybody has the same reaction to that closed system. Right? So one of the things, like, it always amazes me, and I because so many of our parishioners I know and love, and I've learned, are members of very exclusive clubs. And for many of them, that's just home. They've never experienced it as a deeply competitive spot. It's actually been the place they've been welcomed or they've been lifted up, so not everybody experiences it as problematic. And it isn't problematic for everyone, but for anybody who has gone through any shade of that deviation from the norm. And I think that's where, like, the voice of LGBTQ people in, like, the Catholic Church or other places, anything that you do that deviates just a bit from the norm, it becomes, you suddenly feel the intensity of that rivalry. Is that fair to say, Joe?
Yeah, and I want to jump off of that real quick, and also what Chris just said. When someone in a mimetic rivalry decides to take that step to walk away and undoes the rivalry, what happens? Like, let's say we're pulling at this bomber jacket. Well, okay, I just give it to Bill.
Yeah.
Does Bill then even really want it after that, right? And you see it with kids all the time when they're fighting over something and someone gives up. All of a sudden, the object of the rivalry loses its power. You see it in the crucifixion, where once Jesus forgives the thief and dies in a completely non-rivalistic way, when they're telling him, you can get down from the cross, send down fire, join the fight, and he doesn't. Everybody just kind of goes away, right? The fight's over. So there's extreme power in that. You see it in the nonviolent resistance in the civil rights movement.
That's wonderful.
I was going to say, I think there's a lot of mimetic rivalry inside the church.
Yes.
I mean, look at the building we're in. I think that both in terms of, our cathedral is nicer than your cathedral, or taller or whatever, but our branch of Christianity is better than yours, or because you deviate from one aspect of the doctrine, you are scapegoated and exiled from the church. I mean, excommunication is a scapegoating. And so I think there's a challenge within the church to embrace the godliness, what God's calling us within the church as well.
I love that, Mark. That's a brilliant insight, because I do think, the joke I would also make is, when I gave a description of mimetic rivalry to high school students, they were like, yep, that's my reality. And I think also the reason why this caught so fire with academic departments is look at the academic departments. It's hard to imagine a place where there's more mimetic rivalry than an academic department. And I think the church is exactly similar. Like, if you think about clergy all wearing the same thing, how do you differentiate yourself?
We're all sneeches on the beaches.
Yeah.
With stars upon thars.
Yeah.
Online, someone offers
Yes,
this.
thank you.
Great lecture, very interesting. but she finds its reliance on transference to be a bit wonky and elliptical.
Yes, totally right, Jessica. It is wonky and elliptical. It's because I think that's the key to like the theology of it. Because this is how I did the lecture tonight, and I think I got through it okay. But you could do this whole lecture, and I wanted to focus on Girard because he was the person that not everybody knew, but you can't understand Pacific mimesis as an undoing of the scapegoating mechanism by just looking at anthropology, right? Because what happens is if someone just takes it as total loss or walks away, as you're saying, Chris, from a sociological perspective, the game will go on. They've just absented themselves. So nothing actually happens when someone takes the total loss. But what Allison is trying to say, and this is why Girard needs theology, is that with the resurrection, there is a kind of revelation that God's self-giving love is always greater. And God's life is always greater than death. And that is what undoes the scapegoating mechanism, because it can't actually, it breaks that cycle, and it invites you into a different place in which you see your life modeled on someone who gives rather than claims and receives or fights. So yeah, it depends entirely on resurrection at the end of the day.
Just
Large claim.
one little addition on that too is that Girard says that he's just like Augustine in saying that this only works with grace, right?
Yeah.
So it's that idea that we can't stop it. Like you need that power.
Yeah.
Yeah, the joy being wrong looks like to me is that in my experience, wanting to be like others, to be comforted in that external acknowledgement. I would seek and do things based on my self-will and keep doing stuff over and over again to fit in, and then wasn't fitting in, and then I would sit and endure suffering based on those things I was seeking. They were never enough. It was always a fleeting. They once were new, now they're old, now I need something shinier and better. And I would go into that vicious cycle, and the only joy I found out was that I had to endure all kinds of suffering and come out on the other side and realize the very thing I needed to do was let go of searching for all that stuff externally and acknowledge that I can't do this myself, and I needed to get a connection outside of self, which wasn't seen here, and where I was putting my faith in. What was I going to seek to get me out of the suffering? And I think the crucifixion and the resurrection is a perfect, wonderful example that I was finally able to acknowledge and say, you know what, I don't need to suffer anymore. I can give this to God through Jesus is a perfect example of that, and that set me free from wanting to be like or seek or do, and it got me out of that cycle.
And to say, in some ways, by holding on to that Christ who is raised, you found a different kind of community that has pacific mimesis, right?
Yes.
That builds each other up,
Yes.
right? And also that the thing that I thought you said so brilliantly is, in a sense, you've given up the suffering you experienced that you gave up on. It's not that that suffering went away because you expend yourself, but it doesn't come as a kind of drain on yourself. It comes as a way of kind of being yourself or building yourself or growing. Yeah. Go ahead. We had, and Jessica, that was great. You said something about the sins. Why do some people like one sin as opposed to others? That I don't have a good answer for. I think I kind of have had dealer's choice in my life. I don't know. I just The one thing that I did love is that, of course, there are different ways to define this, the greed, and my father-in-law actually, in the longer form of this, which had a list, for him, greed was denying a worker his wages. And that was one of his things that he fastened on, partly because he had employees. So I think all of us find our way into these things. Makes a good t-shirt. Don't you think we should just... What do others think? Anything else from upstairs? All right. Well, that's our beginning, folks. Thank you for doing this. Next week, we're going to have James, Allison. Thank you for putting in to being part of this. And why don't we close in prayer? Do you want to close this, Chris?
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Loving God, we give thanks for you. We give thanks for this time together. Give thanks for the efforts of James, Allison, and Renee Gerard, and Father Bill, and all of us as we seek to understand you and understand your love for us and understand the sacrifice of your Son to lead us into a life of greater love and greater compassion and greater forgiveness and greater mercy. We give thanks for all of this as we continue this journey. Continue to be with us and bless us in this conversation. May it be life-giving and healing and freeing. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.